Okay guys, today we're gonna be watching Big Tug. When 1968 was the craziest year. Make sure to go subscribe. Okay. You hear that, right? Hold on, watch, hear this. I'm trying to click on this. It doesn't work, but oh well. Anyway, make sure to go subscribe to him. I'll subscribe to him later, don't worry. And make sure to like and subscribe. And let's get into it. Now, I think my grandma was born. My great-grandma was born during this period.
Head to extratug.com right now where you can see me absolutely completely naked.
Okay guys, great video. You guys got any other video content reactions recommended? Make sure to comment down below. See you guys later. I'm just joking. That's a crazy info.
Well, that's not true. Chris, zoom out, let them know I'm not completely naked. But it's an exclusive video content on extratug.com if you want to check that out. It does get a little...
So you got a website. What?
Raunchy, at least. Alright, it has come to my attention recently that I look a little extra red all of a sudden, and I don't know how to fix that. I'm gonna ask Chris at one point, but for right now, I look a little bit like a lobster.
Yeah, why are you... well, I have not seen this guy's content, so...
We're gonna push right through that.
This is my first impression of him, was that intro, so...
1968. What do you know about it? That it's a year? There's a lot more going on, obviously. I made a whole video about it, and you're watching the beginning of it. 1968 was one of the craziest...
Man, this guy's aggressive.
...years in history. And I know what you're thinking, Tucker, this year's pretty nuts. A couple years ago was pretty nuts too, but just hear me out. If you...
It was crazy. No, we're not gonna get into it.
Feel like the last 5 years have been an apocalyptic speed run, you're not alone. Since
everything went down as soon as we got 2020, that's when it all came down.
2021 surveys
COVID cursed us.
Have consistently shown the majority of Americans think the year they just lived through sucks ass. But while I recognize the utter darkness of, among other things, getting a full-blown sequel to the measles before Grand Theft Auto 6, I still think that 1968 is one of the most chaotic years throughout all of history, and we're gonna talk about it today. I'm gonna prove my point. We tend to look back on the 60s with tie-dye colored glasses, where like, oh, the hippies were doing free love and shit, that's cool drugs. I can't, Chris, bleep that last one, because every time I bring up that specific drug, they demonetize me immediately. So don't even talk about that. We're not even joking around. But in reality, this was an iffy era that saw anti-establishment movements become politically viable forces across the globe. And this tension culminated in the chaos of 1968, a year featuring so many protests that historians dubbed it the year of barricades. I'm going to try and get through this video about widespread panic and riots and death.
We're going to be learning about a cultural movement
without getting demonetized. So just to clarify, I am not condoning the activities of 1968 as if it's Kanye. Not even the fun ones like Cheeching the Chong or deflowering the power. So the
Chi-Chi what?
As if it's Kanye. Not even the fun ones like Cheeching the Chong or deflowering the power.
Crazy.
So the rampant student...
Okay, so he's not condoning it, so... he supports this?
Protests of the 60s were at least partially due to how horny everything was after World War II. Maybe it was beating up Nazis that put Americans in the mood, or everyone was just trying to get rid of their massive fear boners after our earth-shattering display of nuclear power. Regardless, after the war, the baby boom. Everyone had babies in the West.
Yeah, because all the men came back and, you know, they probably were very lonely during war.
Everyone was just getting busy. In the U.S., over 4.2 million babies were born each year from 1946 to 1964. It was the highest birth rate in America ever. So that's why the baby boomers, that's where their name comes from. And thanks to GI Bill, World War II veterans received financial assistance that helped thousands of families enter the middle class and send their children to college. As a result, by 1968, there were more college students in the U.S. than ever before. And 100,000 of them were members of Students for a Democratic Society, an activist organization.
Maybe they just looked old back then, but she looks like she's 60 now. Okay, him too. I think he looked old back then, huh?
Responsible for campus protests across the country. And one of the biggest of these
Hey, ain't they doing that right now? Are they doing protests at campus? Why are college campuses such a hotspot for protests? Tell me down below.
Protests were the students at Columbia University.
Hey, didn't they do that They're doing it right now at Columbia.
This is where the SDS and the Student Afro-American Society joined forces to occupy several campus buildings for
Youth Against WAK for Fashion 4?
nearly a week. The students were upset to the school's ties to a weapon research think tank, which I understand, and the construction
What does that even mean?
of a new university gym in Harlem. Turns out Ivy League students are a bunch of nerds who don't like getting physically fit. You pussies, lift some iron. Oh wait, it says here that the proposed gym was actually accused of trying to circumvent segregation laws by having separate entrances. So yeah, not good. It was a big reason. That's a good reason to be protesting.
Yeah,
Students and members of the community actually referred to the gymnasium as Jim Crow.
Ah, very clever.
Which is funny. It's very smart and funny. As a white person, I can tell you that there is no coming back from a racially motivated pun of such caliber. At one point, students actually took the dean.
Yeah, you would know. You would know. Very, very expert on this topic. I can easily tell by your stature and coloration.
Henry Coleman hostage. They used furniture to hold Coleman captive in his office for 24 hours. And listen, I was in DePaul University in 2016, the height of protesting over meaningless bullshit. But we were not, these kids would show up and take an Instagram photo of themselves and say, I did something. Then they go back and forget about whatever thing they were doing for the next 2 weeks. These kids were taking people captive, which once again, I do not say that's okay. Do not do that. I'm just saying they were making a f***ing difference.
Yeah, they were actually, no, they were actually doing something, you know? Nowadays, people just say things. They're actually, but don't act. I do not support any violent action against the U.S. government or any government.
We can include in this. Chris, open yard for you. Coleman was released unharmed and apparently well-fed, but you have to imagine what these news reporters sound like to the average American. Student protesters have taken over the administrative building of Columbia University, shutting down classes for a week.
That, what's it called? Invincible, bro? Not Incredibles, yeah, the Incredibles footage.
And now they've taken a hostage. Like, you just assume children are turning into terrorists for some reason. After cutting
Yeah, you were about to say something else. That started with an H.
off the water and telephone lines of the occupied buildings, the president of Columbia eventually called the police. This had the NPD send over 1,000 police officers to the campus, and the school became a
The thing is, back then, the police officers, I don't think they had stretching. That's my chair. Back then, the police officers, they used bayonets, bro. Like, assault guns. Like, not ARs, but like, I don't know, but like AR style the guns. They were ready to like just open fire. They were gonna do a Tiananmen Square massacre, but in the U.S. 'Cause they had like bayonets on their guns, bro. Like they didn't even have riot shields, bro. Not even batons. They just had bayonets and just were ready to stab someone or shoot them.
chaotic blur of violence. Quick caveat, I think it's very funny that the police didn't show up before that point. I just think it's crazy that the police won't show up until someone calls them. And I guess the kids aren't gonna call the police. It's just
Yeah, bro. Why do you think we have 911, bro? That's the main reason is to respond.
so, like the police are driving by a hostage situation being like, well, no one called, so are we... Not our jurisdiction. But after that, it got violent. It wasn't just students who were getting beaten with nightsticks and dragged across cement. Members of the press were harassed too. One New York Times reporter was attacked by a police officer with brass knuckles, while a Life magazine photographer was punched in the eye and had their camera broken. By the time the buildings were cleared, 132 students were injured, along with 4 faculty members and 12 police officers. And 720 students were arrested. But if this goes to show anything, despite the fact that a lot of them got the shit beat out of them, the protesters ultimately won. Columbia terminated its contract with the Institute for Defense Analysis and canceled plans to build a gym. So once again, never do any of this stuff. It works, but never do any of this stuff.
Bro, why don't you do it? If you say, I'm not gonna get into it. I'm not gonna do anything. But at least I know. But you're being up. No, I respect you. I respect you for giving a example of what maybe not maybe works, actually, or works. Don't do it. Don't do it.
Effective. Don't do it. But it wasn't just American students raging against the machine in 1968. The French were getting in on it too. Anytime
Oh wow, how surprising.
America does some revolution, the French are right behind them. Actually, Chris, what came first, the French Revolution or the American Revolution? I think the American
Bro, no, I'm a history buff. Never mind. Never mind. Never mind. Never mind. Never mind. I'm not
did it
gonna get
first. I
into it.
actually have to Google this. This is gonna
Don't Google it. Oh my. How do you not know?
piss me off. What was first, French Revolution or American? The American Revolution occurred. Yeah, you guys came first. Just copycats. Just trying out anything that makes you look cool. God, America's awesome. But just like the Columbia students, the French had two major issues. One, they were against the Vietnam War, and two, they wanted the freedom to spend their night in each other's dorm rooms. So on one hand, major geopolitical issues. On the other hand, they want to have sex. You gotta let the
No, they are still humans after all, so.
kids have sex. But I gotta give it to the French, they don't f around about f***ing around. These students occupied administrative buildings in the University of Paris and caused the school to temporarily close. Eventually, the police were called and several students were arrested, but that was just the beginning. Students at nearby Sorbonne University didn't like the way their peers
This guy, what's his name? Ringo from the Beatles. He kind of looks like him. Maybe it's just the haircut, but he kind of does. Why are you holding that like a musket, bro? Look at this guy. He looks like a ninja.
had been treated, so they started their own protest, which led to the National Student Union in France to call for a protest. Did you know France has a union for students that looks after students and their rights? Crazy
Maybe start one.
nonsense. So students, teachers, and supporters marched through Paris, and they
Yeah, I don't think America needs one because we have something called phones. And no, someone should have a student union.
were met by French riot police who arrested hundreds. All this did was provoke the students even more, and now 40,000 protesters flooded the streets of Paris. They used street signs to
Wow. Arresting people makes people angry? Wow.
build hundreds of barricades and ripped up cobblestones from the street to hurl at French police. The confrontation was violent. The police were hitting them with batons and tear gas, and the students were like,
Why do they always... Did they all have turtleneck shirts, bro? Hold up. Yeah, why do they all have turtlenecks? Or at least the women do. What? No, wait, what up? No, that is a turtle. No, that one doesn't have a turtleneck. She's wearing a trench coat. Not a trench coat, but something. Why were turtlenecks so common then?
street signs to build hundreds of barricades and ripped up cobblestones from the street. And the students were like, these rocks ain't working. Get the Molly cocktails. We're burning this bitch down. I don't know why I'm making the French Bostonians. Hundreds of students and officers were hospitalized. And here's where the difference between France and America really comes to light. In America, student protests are seen in a condescending light. 1968 presidential candidate Richard Nixon said they called themselves flower children. I call them spoiled rotten. Which I guess at that time was a big burn. Boomers love calling people spoiled. They fucking love that. I hate them. Although I don't even know if Nixon was a boomer. I'm not going to take out the Google phone again, but he has a boomer.
He was the original boomer.
Mentality. But in France, the citizens were horrified by the police brutality, and not only did they sympathize with the students, they were galvanized by their actions. So these protests boiled over.
Wow, they're actually being sympathetic to a bad cause that people are protesting about. Wow.
Into a general strike that saw 10 million French workers either walk out of their jobs or occupy their factories. France was nearly overthrown because a bunch of students wanted to do hand stuff in their dorms.
Now, didn't they also get... There was this big... I think, like, in the past decade, France has been a lot of riots. There was even a riot because they raised the retirement age by 1 year.
That's France, baby. How come we don't do general
We a bitch, that's why.
protests? General worker strikes.
Yeah, because you a bitch, that's why. We ain't doing that.
This video's getting real democratic. As violent as the French student protests got, it pales in comparison to what happened to the Mexican students in 1968. Everyone, all these
Also, individualism.
kids were pissed in 1968. What became
It works. Nothing's gonna happen. No, we did give the Writers Guild strike.
known as the
Then people were like, "Hey, we're just gonna use AI," but it didn't work. So I think it did change some stuff. I don't know.
A lot of local massacres,
but it did work slightly.
Began when high school students started a street fight after a soccer match. Riot police were dispatched to stop the fight, but then all the students turned to the riot officers and were like, We're cool, let's beat the shit out of this guy. He looks like a dork. The confrontation between the cops and the kids lasted literally for hours until the army was called in for support. The fighting ended after several students were killed when the authorities used a bazooka to destroy the main door.
What? Students' movement it started from a street fight between high school students after a football game. The students confronted the Mexico City riot police in there to end the skirmish. After hours of student resistance, the army was called in to quench the violence. The siege ended with the soldiers blasted to the main door of the National Preparatory School in San Alonso, with the bazooka killing some of the students in
the school. So if that gives you any idea of how unhinged the law enforcement of Mexico used to be, I don't know how they're doing now, but they didn't use.
Well, I guess now I think they're actually doing better than a couple years ago.
Use a goddamn battering ram. They were like, fire! College students quickly organized to protest the violence police used, and for several months, student protests and rallies took place in the streets of Mexico City. But there was just one problem. You know the Olympics? That was supposed to happen there that summer, so they had to figure some shit out.
What is this, bro? This is the most ugly Olympics thing I've ever seen. Why is there so many squiggles?
Fast. Mexico's authoritarian president at the time, Gustavo Díaz Ordaz, was already known for squashing any
big lips.
form of dissent, and he was tired of these student protests and wanted them gone before the games. So when
looks like Mr. Incredible's bosses, dude. You remember him?
10,000
Stephen King looking guy.
peaceful protesters showed up 10 days before the opening ceremony. Thousands of soldiers, along with a secret government-run branch
They just holding that in public, bro, huh? They did not give a shit.
Of security created for the Olympics were dispatched to capture the leader of the student movement. And how did they do this? They were real subtle. They opened fire on all of the protesters with real guns. For several hours, it was a dizzying blur of gunshots that left scores of dead bodies piling up on the streets as protesters were surrounded on all
They actually did a Tiananmen Square massacre in Mexico.
sides. To
Mexico. Never mind.
this
Never
day,
mind. Never mind.
there is no actual death count for the massacre because they covered it all up. Historians and scholars estimate the death toll could exceed 300. And it wouldn't be until 2001 that we would learn that the Mexican military snipers had been instructed to shoot at the troops in order to provoke them into opening fire on the crowd. That's a lot. A little over a week later, the massacre of hundreds of nonviolent protesters successfully was covered up, and the opening
Never mind. I thought these guys were naked.
ceremony of the 1968 Olympics took place. So, you know, anything for the Olympics. Anything to see a guy throw a ball real god far. And that's when I'm going to stop talking about the students, because, I mean...
Yeah, we gotta kill these people because they're intervening about the guy who can, like, jump really, really far. That was a joke, YouTube.
This whole video can't be about the students. Before the history buffs come at me, I know there was a lot more dissenting student shit that happened in 1968. There was even more protests in Brazil, Poland, Japan, Italy, and Czechoslovakia. However, I do want to dedicate a little bit more time to other political upheaval that happened in 1968. So I'm going to pivot from police brutality to assassinations, because there was a ton of them. Actually, not just political assassinations.
I think more military brutality than police.
Everyone was getting killed in
Well, I think more military.
this year for some reason. By 1968, Andy Warhol had become one of the most famous artists in America. Whether you love or
There was still a lot of police brutality, but the people that were actually, like, killing people were the army back in the day.
hate Andy Warhol,
Now it's the police.
depends on which type of art student you are. But there's no denying that his pop art paintings of Campbell's soup cans and Coke bottles were weirdly influential. He was also like the dead center of much of New York's creative world. His Manhattan warehouse, known as the Factory, was
Okay, so the most creative thing in New York back then was canned soup and Coca-Cola bottles.
was one part studio and one part party destination, where the band Velvet Underground served as like the live band, and a bunch of celebrities rubbed elbows and did so many drugs. And I would just like to talk to YouTube directly real here. I do not condone doing any drugs. Doing drugs is very, very bad. It's the #1 way to die in America, I think. Don't do them.
No, it's a heart attack.
These guys were
so large.
doing them, and they're all dipshits, and they're all dead. And because Warhol was part of this douchebag hip New York underground, he often associated with some unsavory characters, like Valerie Solanas. Solanas was a writer and radical feminist who was the founder and sole member of an organization called SCUM, which stood for Society of Cutting Up Men, which I'm all for feminism. That's a bit much.
You know what? I like to call myself a feminist. But even I think that's a little too much.
1967, she self-published the Scum Manifesto, which called for an
Okay, as soon as you make a manifesto, that's when things start to turn bad.
overthrow of the
Any organization that has a manifesto, I think, becomes a terrorist group.
government, the elimination of money, and the elimination
Especially if a single person makes a manifesto, look out for that guy.
of the male sex, which
Or woman.
is a lot. Actually, Chris, could you throw on some jazzy tunes while I read an excerpt from this manifesto? The male
Yeah, back in the day, it was very sexist, so maybe she was onto something.
is a biological accident. The Y gene is an incomplete X gene. That is, an incomplete set of chromosomes. In other words, the male is an incomplete female, a walking abortion aborted at the gene stage. To be male is to be deficient, emotionally limited. Maleness is a deficiency disease, and males are emotionless cripples. Or emotional cripples, whatever, same vibe. So I bet she was fucking fun
Look,
at parties, holy shit.
low-key, isn't that a thing? Isn't that actually a big problem for males? And they're bad with emotions, huh? So maybe she was onto something. I don't support her. I don't support her actions. She was a evil person from what I heard. But she did raise one good point in a very bad way.
There's a limit to it, okay? God. Solanas tried to get Warhol to produce a play she wrote called Up Your Ass.
Hey, why would you go to a male? Your whole thing is you hate men. Why are you going to a men for help?
And also
Go find a powerful woman.
try to
This was 1960. Maybe it's much more limited.
get him to promote Scum. Warhol, unexpectedly, really wasn't feeling this whole fucking weird vibe she was putting out, especially when she
Yeah, he's kind of like your entire enemy, bro. Why would he help you?
suggested he could become part of the Scum Men's Auxiliary, which
Okay. Okay. You know in Attack on Titan where the Marlians are like, hey, these Eldians are subhuman, but some of them are good. This is literally Attack on Titan. This is literally Attack on Titan. What they're doing in Marley and Eldia.
according to her manifesto, would work diligently to eliminate themselves. So that's a bad job description off the rip.
Didn't World War II Germany do something similar where they would get like Slavic people to join their like the double S thing? Didn't they do that?
You're putting
I might be wrong, but did they do that? I can't tell.
yourself out of a job.
I can't remember.
You know, it's like building code and then leaving. You don't want to do that. In 1968, Solanas became paranoid that Warhol was trying to steal her manuscript for Up Your Ass, so she put her radical ideas into action. She entered Warhol's studio and shot him twice, damaging his liver, spleen, esophagus, and lungs. At one point, doctors officially declared
Guns are the ultimate equalizer, I guess.
Warhol dead. They were able to revive him, but Warhol would have to wear a corset to help hold his organs in place for the rest of his life.
Oh my god.
And just hours after the shooting, Solanas walked up to a random cop in Times Square and gave herself up. She would leave a complicated legacy.
Yeah, you should have. Never mind, I'm not gonna say it.
Though her work is still studied in some women's and gender studies courses to this day. Which, I don't want to put any bad faith on the gender and women's studies, but you probably shouldn't be teaching what this bitch is talking about, because holy that's too much. But while Solanas advocated for an aggressive and violent brand of activism, Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy
Hey, MLK, the GOAT.
was one of nonviolence and civil disobedience. We love MLK in America. We name streets after him. We have a holiday for him. The FBI killed him. We're gonna talk about that. Despite an approach that earned him a Nobel Peace Prize, many Americans were threatened by his influence and remained openly hostile to the idea of desegregation. Even the FBI investigated King for supposed communist ties, and when they found none, they still continued.
Yeah, speaking of the FBI killing people, wasn't it actually proven in declassified files that that the CIA didn't kill JFK? Or am I just dumb?
spying on him, with FBI Director Edgar Hoover calling King a
Yeah, did people not know that the FBI did not uh, did kill MLK, bro?
what is it, notorious liar. They just didn't like that he was black and proud, I guess. I don't know. I don't want to get into it. I'm not the guy.
Yeah, yeah. Bro, it was 1968. What do you expect? It was very, very bad for people.
As hard as
Black
King
people.
tried to keep the civil rights movement peaceful, racial tensions often erupted into violence. In February of 1968, 3 black students were killed by police in South Carolina for protesting racial segregation at a bowling alley. But despite the setbacks and harassment that this man
R.I.P., bro. R.I.P.
was getting MLK, he still continued down the path of civil disobedience, which is why he found himself in Memphis that spring supporting black sanitation workers who were on strike. As King left his motel room for dinner that night, he was shot 1 time in the head, being assassinated. The evening before his murder, King gave his final prophetic speech known as "I've been to the mountaintop" speech. In it, he said, and I probably should just play the clip. I can't put the same vibe on it. All right, I'll say.
Play the clip. You're a white man. Let the black man speak.
I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I've seen the promised land. I want to do it, dude. I want to do the voice. I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land. I want to run through a wall right now. Despite everything I just did, King's assassination threw the US into turmoil. As the director of the Congress of Racial Equality told the New York Times that evening, nonviolence is a dead philosophy, and it was not the black people that killed it. Rioting spread across America, with over 100 cities experiencing protests that led to thousands of injuries, arrests, and deaths. In Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and Chicago, rioting was so intense that the National Guard and federal troops were brought in. Chicago Mayor Richard Daley went so far.
It's wild that back then we would just call in the military when people would protest, bro.
As to give police orders to kill
I think they still do, too.
arsonists and maim or cripple looters. In Wilmington, Delaware, Governor Charles Terry asked for assistance from the National Guard, which led to a 9-month military occupation, the longest military occupation of an American city in U.S. history. And this is the part of the script where I don't know if I can talk about how, like, it's pretty obvious that the FBI killed Martin Luther King. I'm just gonna throw it to you guys. I'm gonna say, go Google that shit. It's a conspiracy theory, but not really. Just go look. I'm not Wendigoon. You know, I can't make videos that are like investigative. I don't have
Yeah, you're not good at that. Just keep telling us to the slot, bro.
that time, but please go learn you some. It is insane. One of the few cities that didn't see rioting was Indianapolis, thanks to a speech given by RFK. Kennedy was running for the Democratic nomination for president and had a campaign stops in Indiana on the day of King's assassination. Upon learning of MLK's death, Kennedy gave an impassioned speech in a majority black area of Indianapolis. For many in the audience, it was the first of them hearing of MLK's assassination. Kennedy's speech appealed to people's sense of compassion while urging for peace. He evoked the memory of his brother, John F. Kennedy, who was assassinated just 5 years earlier. And this speech was also the first time that RFK publicly addressed his brother's dying. So a lot of shit going on here. It is considered by many historians to be one of the greatest speeches in American history, and it is credited with saving Indianapolis from a riot. However, just 2 months later, while celebrating his win in the California primary, RFK was shot in the kitchen of an Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. And it was just 1 day after Andy Warhol's assassination attempt. This is the part in America where we were like, should people have guns? I don't think so. I think people cannot be trusted, I think. This was the chaos of 1968, just a never-ending conveyor belt of murder and pain. In less than 3 months after Robert Kennedy's assassination, Chicago would host the Democratic National Convention. Now, this part of the story is everything I've talked about amped up to the millionth max. So I've already talked about at length the police riots that happened in 1968 in my Cold War video that got demonetized, and it was really long and a lot of effort, and I'm so pissed about that. But the violence of the convention was really just the boiling over point for tensions that had been rising for weeks. And these tensions served as a microcosm for much larger issues that were happening in 1968. Mayor Richard Daley was on high alert after riots had burned down much of Chicago's west side 4 months earlier, and he was hell-bent on avoiding another disaster. Meanwhile, new left groups like the Youth International Party, also known as Yippies, had descended on Chicago, freaking out.
It's a terrible name. Yippee!
with their street theater and political activism. They were licking the bean. Chris, find out when the bean was put up in Chicago. Was it around 1968? I bet not. The uneasy mood was underscored by the recent assassination of RFK, which had led to a power vacuum within the Democratic Party while suggesting that any political moment could lead to violence. More straight-laced citizens became paranoid when the Yippies joked that they were going to spike the city's water with which was just an appetizer for their bigger prank, which was, oh my god, nominating a pig for president. That's so funny. These guys don't suck at all. While activist Jerry Rubin read Pegasus's acceptance speech, cops arrested Pegasus and 7 other Yippies
Team damage.
for disorderly conduct. Meanwhile, within the actual convention itself, many anti-war Democrats were enraged when a pro-war candidate, Vice President Hubert Humphrey, which...
Hubert what?
What a name. Put that name on money. I don't care if he's a piece of shit. Hubert Humphrey? I want that man to sell me oil. He was chosen as the Democratic presidential nominee by delegates. Humphrey had entered the race too late to run in the state primaries, and many thought that establishment Democrats had worked behind the scenes to assure Humphrey would get the nomination. Sound familiar? Remember when Clinton did that shit to Bernie? Why did we all forget about that? They f***ed Bernie over. We could have had Bernie as president. The Democrats f***ing suck, dude.
Could we have Bernie Sanders as president? No. No, he's too niche for real.
Always suck. While many delegates voiced their disapproval inside the convention, by the time a full-blown police riot had erupted out in the streets. The result made the Democratic Party look unable to rein in the chaos of the era, and even as the anti-war movement grew in support, that November, pro-Vietnam Republican Richard Nixon would be elected president. So, didn't work out. The Democrats have their heads up their own ass.
What did that say? Please.
With infighting and not being able to get a goddamn thing done, and then the Republicans win. What? I've never seen that happen before. 9 times in my lifetime. Holy f. Okay, alright. That was a lot of violence we just talked about.
Yeah, he's definitely passionate about it.
That was a lot of violence. So let's end on an upbeat note. Pop culture. That's fun, right? Well, sort of. There was a seismic shift in 1968, and that manifested itself within TV, music, sports, all the crazy shit. 1968 saw the release of classic records by Aretha Franklin, The Zombies, Van Morrison, Otis Redding, The Temptations, and the Rolling Stones, along with the Beatles' White Album, which was fantastic and also contained the song Helter Skelter. But Charles Manson would then distort the meaning of Helter Skelter, claiming that it held a secret message about an impending race war. And less than a year later, his cult would scrawl the words
What?
Helter Skelter and blood on the scene of one of their grisly murders. So you can't blame Paul McCartney for that one. But before the release of this cult anthem, the Beatles started in 1968 in India. During the 60s, the West had developed a fascination with Eastern spirituality, and the influence of Indian music and themes were found in many psychedelic rock songs.
Yeah, because most people think there was a big Buddhist moment, or what's it called? Monk people. Not monks. People became Buddhist monks.
Which led to the Fab Four visiting India to study transcendental meditation.
And people just wanted to take mushrooms and get high out of their mind back then. This was just an excuse to do that, I'm gonna be real.
Is that right? Transcendental. Chris, leave all that in.
Transcendental.
I'm stupid. The Beatles weren't alone in India. Mike Love of the Beach Boys, English folk singer Donovan, and actress Mia Farrow were also there to study. However, the Beatles' stay would be short. They left after Farrow and another female student claimed that their meditation yogi had inappropriately touched them. Which...
Uh-oh.
That happens in yoga. Those f***ers are all perverts. 1968 would also see the release of Johnny Cash's Radical Live at Folsom Prison album. That rips. If you don't know anything, that's as good as Alvin Flame's Kill Alvin album. That's as good as The Yuppies Are Winning. That's as good as Wrong Balloon. You guys should listen to all 3 of those albums. But anyway, also Folsom Prison. Cash was no stranger to performing for prisoners. He would do so over 30 times in his career, with the first of these performances taking place in 1957 at Huntsville State Prison. But Live at Folsom Prison was the first of his prison performances put to tape, and was especially revered due to the fact that one of his most iconic songs was 1955's Folsom Prison Blues. Not only has Live at Folsom Prison achieved legendary status in music history, but it kicked off a lifetime of prison reform advocacy by Cash, including his U.S. Senate hearing testimony in 1972. Just to put this in perspective, the modern day equivalent of this would be like if Morgan Wallen got out there and just did literally anything remotely not dickish. Anything remotely not douchebaggery.
And what did Morgan Darlin do?
Everyone would be like, that just changed the game. Oh my fucking God. Are you kidding me? He's normal for a second? Gotta delete all my hate comments now. By 1968, over 90% of US households owned a television. We're shifting quickly into television now. In between horrific news updates on the Vietnam War, assassinations and protests, classic shows like Star Trek were beamed into living rooms across the country. But even Captain Kirk wasn't immune from challenging social norms. It's 1968 after all. And in 1968, Star Trek boldly went where no TV show had gone before, easy and obvious pun, televising the first interracial kiss in the history of American television. Now,
Oh my God, interracial love in My American TV Show. We gotta cancel it.
I've heard this fact before, and that's like a big deal, but in all honesty, this kiss was not romantic. Have you ever actually watched it? In the episode, aliens genetically tortured the crew until Captain Kirk and Lieutenant, I don't know how to say her name, I'm not a fucking Trekkie,
What did you just say?
Yora, they're forced to French kiss. But despite the fact the writers literally had to put torture in the scene to force them to kiss, it was a historic moment.
I don't think that's a good first interracial kiss, bro.
Keep in mind, this was only a few years after the Supreme Court deemed interracial marriage legal, which is crazy to think about. Also, less than 60 years ago, it was illegal to be interracially married in America. That's something I don't really put to paper that much. Like, we suck, dude. Nichelle Nichols, the actress who played Lieutenant Uriah, wrote it in her memoir that she only received one somewhat negative letter from a Southerner that read, quote, this is actually crazy, I am totally opposed to the mixing of races. However, anytime a red-blooded American boy like Captain Kirk gets a beautiful dame in his arms that looks like Aurora, wherever the fucking...
I may be racist, but damn. That's basically what he's saying.
Name is, he ain't gonna fight it, I'll tell you that much right now. So I guess in a weird sort of a way, that's progress. The dude was like, f it, she's hot, I don't give a f. It was cool to watch, keep going. As 1968 wound down, a Christmas Eve was the first
You gotta get attracted people to stop racism for real.
time humans saw other humans orbit around the moon in the Apollo 8. It served as an appetizer for the moon landing the following year, while mercifully closing out the chaotic year with a little hope and perspective. So now that we've closed out the little story of 1968, can you guys compare anything? In the comments down below, let me know any obvious connections we have between 1968 and the last 6 years. It's all been terrible, so I want to see if you guys have any, like, really tight connections between these two things. New videos every Wednesday and new videos every Saturday and every other Wednesday. Like, comment, and subscribe. Actually do all of those things, and while you're at it, check out Extra Tug. New video every week for $4, but that's not even the big thing. You get your name at the end of the video. You guys already know that shit. You're looking at it right now. We do polls. We started doing it.
I gave it. Okay, guys. That was the end of this video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Tell me any videos you want me to watch in the comment section below. See you then.